Hello, everybody, and welcome to All Together Unplugged. Today, we're going to have a creative conversation about race. In lieu of recent events, we've had riots, protests, just social upheaval. And we think it's important to be able to gather great people together, to be able to creatively think about how racial reconciliation can actually be a reality for us. And so I'm just going to throw the ball up to a few of my friends and my wife and let everybody just introduce themselves to you. So feel free. Let's start with Jonathan.
Okay, I am Jonathan Goode. I am the executive director of Orchard, which some of you may have heard of as Atlanta Community Ministries, which was founded out of Second-Ponce almost 25 years ago.
Wow.
So.
That's cool.
I'm Lauren Scott. I am Josh's wife, but I'm also an account supervisor for Pep Promotions, and I lead a team of project managers at Georgia Pacific.
Awesome.
And my name is Peyton Bell. I have been a member here at Second-Ponce, I guess now for 5 years.
Yeah, man.
So my wife and I moved to Atlanta after we graduated from law school. We're both attorneys here. We have a 2-year-old daughter. And yeah.
Man, that's awesome, man. Thank you all for your introductions. I thought for sure you all would be able to get all of your titles and everything correct, and you all definitely did that, man. And so, man, we're going to go ahead. I have my questions right here on my phone, and we're going to go ahead and just dive into deep water. We're going to just pose the question, and anyone who feels so led, just go ahead and answer it in whatever way God leads you. And so, hey, I got to say this from the jump. Share your heart, man. There is no censor here. So let's dive into deep water. Why is racial reconciliation challenging? What do you think makes it so challenging for our society today?
Well, it's very nice that you started this conversation on race with a really easy question, Josh. But I think and I say that kind of jokingly, but there are two aspects of racial reconciliation that are challenging. And there are two words there. There's racial and reconciliation. And so if you just look at the idea of reconciliation, that in and of itself is challenging. It's difficult for us to even understand, and we spend time and time studying and praying and trying to understand our reconciliation with God and how God allows us to reconcile with God even though we are sinners. And if it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around that reconciliation, then reconciliation among imperfect humans is going to be even more challenging in some ways. So I think it's a combination of just the idea that reconciliation is difficult, and then the reconciliation among humans, among sinners, is even more difficult.
I think that is challenging because in order to how do you forgive something that continues to happen, right? And so if there was like some stopping point where it was like, as of this day, there have been no more racial injustice or systemic racism, then maybe we could start to forgive. But it's like every time you maybe get to a point where you're not as angry anymore and you could start to, forgive, something else happens. So if I'm still just as angry as I was 2 years ago, how do I ever begin to have the forgiveness that is a part of reconciliation? And so I think that the answer there, that's kind of the question, right? Like, how do you stop it from happening? How do you stop racial incidences from occurring so that people could start to heal and then be open to forgiveness?
That's good.
Yeah, I think I have to speak as a white man because that's who I am. And so I think for me to try to I think that causes the answer to the question to have to be a little bit more focused on other white people, because I can only really, I think, accurately speak to that experience. And I think one of the main challenges is that until the protests kind of started really sort of ramping up, frankly, we didn't have to care. I mean, that's a painful thing to say, but for people who are often just worried about things, and even when it comes to causes that affect people who look like them, or even, I know a lot of people who have they've had family experiences where they had to experience some traumatic thing like childhood cancer or something, and they get really involved in that as something they care about. Ultimately, it's because they experienced it. That was the thing. And so for white people to choose to participate in this in an ongoing, persistent way is going to require them to sincerely look outside of themselves and ask, what does love require of me? And that's I actually had someone talk to me about this and say, the exact quote was, not everyone is just hunting for problems like you are. That was the sort of sense that he felt from my desire to be a part of this what I believe is racial inequality and racial just problems in our time and in our country. But yet I responded back and said, no, but the people of Christ should be, because our call is to bring light and life anywhere that it needs to move forward, and that can only happen when you acknowledge the places it needs to move forward.
I hear that. Thank you all for your thoughtful answers to that. I hear you saying, it was brought to the forefront. People, they didn't have to care, but now it's in your face, you have to care now. But I guess along that same line, is racial reconciliation a dream that we'll never see? Or can it actually and truthfully become our reality? That's my next question, because I hear us saying we're sinful people. I hear you saying, hey, we need to stop the injustices. But I also hear you saying it was brought to the forefront, so what do we do now? Is it a dream? Or is it a reality?
I think that it can be a reality, but it is a very difficult reality to reach, right? And so I think that it's going to really require that we look at every single area of life where racism lives. So like, we know that it's not just about police brutality and what police are doing to Black people. It's about the banks, it's about schools, it's about organizations, it's about what do leadership teams look like at Fortune 500 companies. And so until people take the time to say, we're gonna look at every law, every policy, every handbook, just everywhere where racism is hiding or is living in plain sight, and change it and like break it down and start all over again, that's the only way it becomes a reality. And so it does take, to Jonathan's point, the people who are leading these organizations, the people who have the power to recognize it as a problem and say, this is something that I want to do something about, and not be afraid to speak up and stand out whenever you see racism, whoever is perpetuating it, to say that's not right and we can't have that.
That's good.
It's a strange problem, because my honest answer to your question is no. But it's not, and the reason that feels so weird is that usually it feels like if there's not an end result that I am looking at, that I truly have hope that it will perfectly obtain, then often our response is to say, well, then what's the point? So I do believe there are ways that we can make progress. Everything you said, all those pieces are part of progress, but unless all of them happen, it's not true reconciliation. And so I think that to some extent, Christians, those of us who are following Christ, and so I know there's probably people who would watch this who maybe they're searching and they're not following Christ at this point, and that wouldn't be how they would claim themselves. So for a moment, I'll ask them to just kind of hang out while I say something specifically about the people who follow Christ. We have to decide to try to bring heaven to earth anyway, and to keep figuring out, what does it mean What does it mean? I mean, this is why I'm so thankful for Christ in this fight, is that I know that ultimately my security is tight. And because I know that ultimately my security is tight, it allows me to approach this issue in true freedom. Because part of the freedom of this means that there are places in my life that I might have to give up power. I may have to lay down places where currently I have authority to actually help bring progress in this issue. And you're only able to do that if you feel like your security is intact. You can't choose to do that if you're trying to fight for yours. That's the challenge, is that if you're not in Christ, you don't have that security. You're looking for it somewhere. But I think that's why I would say no, even though I hate saying no, because I don't want to be the guy who sounds like he's just sort of on everything.
No, it's okay. We asked for your truth. Peyton?
Well, I'm going to take the other answer and say yes to both. So, is it a dream? Yes. Is it something that we can expect and hope for? Yes. And I think that there's a difference between a dream and hope. And our hope ultimately is that humanity will be reconciled in the kingdom of God. And that will happen. I feel confident that will happen. Now, in terms of like in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we can dream that we will have racial reconciliation here. And there are steps that we can take to make that more possible. And there are places in the world that have recovered from a system of racial injustice much faster. You look at, so one of my absolute heroes in life is Bryan Stevenson. Read his book Just Mercy several years ago. He spoke at my law school when I was a student there. I watched Just Mercy on Friday. They're letting you watch it for free on Amazon right now. And Bryan Stevenson has pointed out several times that if you go to Germany today, you cannot walk around without seeing an acknowledgement of the treacherous Holocaust. And not painted in any, defensive light. It is just, you can hardly go anywhere without seeing evidence of bad actions in the context that it was bad. And it might make people uncomfortable, but like Michael said earlier, Jonathan Michael's his brother. We were talking about him earlier. We're not hunting for problems. Yeah. Problems are here, and it's just whether or not you have a choice. You hunt for the problems, or you cover them up. And right now, our society covers them up. Yeah. And we all need to, our obligation as Christians is to hunt these problems down. And you look at the people marching, they are not all Christians, and yet there is this desire to bring these problems to the forefront to resolve them.
And it seems like that's what's happening in 2020. In a lot of ways, it feels like 2020 is what I imagine 1968 felt like, where you have people who are at a point where they are choosing to voice their pain and their frustration and their hurt so loudly that you have to hear it. Now, I don't know how that plays out into the future, and I think that's a real question that I think so important for the people of Christ to seize this moment and to not let it go a little bit. That I'm afraid we're going to just move on to the next headline. We still have a presidential election this year. Like, there's things that are still going to unfold, and that's just what we know.
Well, I hear us saying that basically we're mixed. Some feel it's a dream. Some people feel it's a reality. Me personally, I have never felt so hopeless. Really, I'm just looking at these type of things that continue to happen, and it has really, really tap danced and made me ask the question, do you have faith? Not Sunday school faith, but like faith that Jesus can do this. And so, man, I have had to flood my mind with the hope of Christ because, man, it has just been almost as if we're running a marathon and the finish line keeps moving back, like we'll never reach it. But I keep being reminded that we have this ministry of reconciliation, and I just don't believe God is a liar. So I lie with the camp that this can happen, but I know it is so messy for it to happen. And like you said, man, looking and reimagining the structures, man, that's a hard look. That's hurtful to some people. Think about like even the flag, in NASCAR, they say you can't have the Confederate flag and all of that. So I guess you've even had one NASCAR driver say, I'm just going to retire. That's it. He says, I don't even want to look at a new policy, and that's going to lead me.
He didn't win any races.
I had never heard of him. I was like, who are you, man? But hey, but still, man, the fact that he felt that compelled to say, I don't want that change, and I guess that's where I'm leading into this follow-up question for that. What do we have to give up or relinquish for racial reconciliation to occur? What does that look like?
So two things kind of jump out at me on what we have to give up, and speaking as a white man, we have to give up our comfort, and we have to give up our competitive advantage. And I remember the first time that I was like confronted with the idea of white privilege and with that term. And I was in college, I think I was a sophomore, and we had a speaker, and it was very uncomfortable to hear that phrase and to think about it, and fully I will acknowledge that I personally had I got defensive just in kind of just understanding this new thing. And I had been a person who had always seen myself as I read John Lewis's book when I was like 14 years old. Like I always wanted to be in the movement, and but you have to acknowledge a competitive advantage in society. And then, if we're actual followers of Christ, there should be times, no matter what, there should be times that we can look at our life that we gave up opportunities to make more money or to have fame, however you want to define that. And I think that we need to view white privilege in a similar manner. Like there needs to be specific times where we find opportunities to let go of the competitive advantage that we get out of that privilege.
That's good.
I would say similarly comfort as well, but I think in a different manner. So I think we have to get comfortable having tough conversations like the one we're having today. I think that we, even as Black people, have to be open to, answering questions if white people have questions about, how they can support us or how they can, fight back or fight for us or that type of thing. So to me, that would be a little uncomfortable because for so long, the norm has been not to talk about it, right? To sweep it under the rug, to act like everything's okay. So I think we also have to get comfortable speaking up in places where we previously hadn't. So on our jobs, where we feel like there's more our companies could do, speak up and say, you don't have any people of color or minorities in your leadership team. What do we have in place to fix that? In our churches, how are we making people feel welcome where anybody walks through the door and they feel like they can be at home and join us and be a part of us and truly be a part of our family? In our schools, we have to give up like the statues that are coming down, the name changes on buildings, on campuses. We have to get rid of everything that, maybe is comforting to some people, but makes anyone else uncomfortable. So I think there's a lot that has to be given up for us to ever hope to see reconciliation.
So I would agree from a social standpoint with everything that they said, and I don't really feel like there's a ton I can add to that. I would ask, is it okay if I have like a pastoral moment, a little one?
Go ahead. We'll pass the offering plate.
Okay. So I thought about this before I came in here. I've been following Christ for 20 years. And I believe him when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and that no man gets to the Father but through him. I believed that originally because there were people who held the scriptures in high authority who placed that before me. I believe that now because of my experience. Like, as my life has progressed, I have discovered that following Christ is a wise move, and it has never let me down. The times I have been let down has been when I haven't. And so, because of that, in love, I want as many people as possible to experience him as they can. I want as many people to know who Christ is and to have a relationship with him and experience his love personally as possible. And I think there's a lot of Christians who want the same thing. And that's where I think this is an opportunity for the church. But it's an opportunity that comes with some costs. And it's an opportunity that if you think about it, this shouldn't surprise us. We've always had to learn how to acclimate ourselves to reach people who are far from God. That's been, if you look over the course of history, when the church has really thrived, we have thrived at reaching people for Christ when we have figured out how to speak the language of the moment. And I've heard now for years, some of my older brother and sisters concerned about the way society's heading and the lost opportunity for Christians to be a voice within it. And I have to say, and I think what's clear with all that's happening around us right now is that people who are far from faith care about social issues. They care about it and are vocal about it in a way that our parents weren't and our grandparents weren't. It's not to say that one thing's right or one thing's wrong. It's just to say that they are more all in on it. And if the church is going to be a prophetic voice to the world, we have to talk about the things they're talking about. We have to care about them, and we have to listen to them. We've got to actually hear people speak in to problems that could exist in the culture of a local church, and actually then, this is the hard part, be willing to change the culture. Like, things that at one point were great and helpful at advancing the cause of Christ aren't necessarily things that work today. And we know that in for-profit communities all the time, but for some reason in the community of faith, that hasn't always translated. And I think this race conversation is something that people are screaming out, like, we want you to hear us. The church has the opportunity to hear the people crying. Yeah. And that, is there anything at all more Christ-like than that? Like, that's a moment to say, man, we will change worldly things that are fleeting and fading if that causes us to enter into a closer relationship with you and to become more of a oneness under the banner of Christ. Like, it's worth it. It's worth whatever you have to sacrifice in order to make it happen.
Yeah. No, I agree, but I don't think it's just people who are not a part of faith that are screaming about these issues. I think that's one thing that the church is deficient on. The church doesn't understand that there are people in your pews. There are people in your youth departments. There are people in your young adult departments. There are people in your college departments that care deeply about these issues, and we're trying to lump them into their mother and father's faith, believing that, oh, they're going to think just like them. That's the total wrong way to think. Because some of them are side by side protesting. Some of them are side by side rioting. And so, I guess that's my question that I pose up next is the curveball. What do you think about that? What do you think about the riots and the protests? Are they good for society? Are they horrible for society? What do you think?
Recently, one thing that I've thought a lot about was what made this time different, right? So was there some tipping point number of Black people who had to die for the world to say, okay, now we do believe that this is really a problem? And a lot of people have said that they think it's because of the lockdown. There was nothing else that people could pay attention to, so they had no choice but to say, okay, yeah, Black lives, they do matter. And so to me, I think it is a result of that. I think it's a result of the fact that, for so long, everything else has been tried. Peaceful protests, kneeling, petitions, taking pictures with hoods on, running 2.23 miles. Like, we've tried all types of other things, and people have just gotten to the point where none of those things worked and none of those things moved the needle. And so I don't agree. I don't think that damaging property is, a positive thing or a good thing. But I think people have gotten to the point where it was just kind of, what else do we do? And, and I think it became what is the one thing that people pay attention to? And it's when property is damaged, when things cost money, when it causes people to have to pay attention because it impacts them. And so I think that's what the riots, why they have occurred. I think people were just like, well, let's try the most extreme thing we can think of, and that's what they came up with.
Yeah, I agree with Lauren in that I don't see protest as an inherently good or bad thing. Okay. And I guess in some situations I could see a riot as a particularly bad thing. In this situation, it's difficult for me to view it as a good or a bad thing because it is a very honest reaction that people are having to what is a bad thing, which is racially based attacks on Black people by the police and others. And what can be a good thing is what happens as a result of it. I mean, even if you think about a protest like the March on Washington, you can think of it as a good thing because there was the Civil Rights Bill was passed and good things happened as a result from it. It's a terrible thing that had to happen. Yeah. It's a terrible thing that in the 1960s, people had to organize in that fashion for basic human rights, and the right to vote was taken away. I mean, so a protest is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. I mean, it's terrible that it has to happen. And so I think that what we do from it is, or out of it, and with the awareness that's brought, is what matters.
I've thought this was a problem for a long time. These racial challenges, I've been sensitive to them for a while. At the same time, in an effort to love my neighbor as myself, I don't want anyone's property getting damaged, and I don't want any lives taken or I don't want any more lives taken. That's why I think this is a problem. But would we be having this conversation if they hadn't happened? If the riots hadn't happened, would it have grabbed our attention this much? So I want to stand here and say Martin Luther King was right when he advocated for peaceful protests. I don't think this was all bad. And I think it's hard to say that. I still think there will need to be some sort of way that peaceful conversations can happen if you want actual policy change. if that's something that is a true desire, you have to pass laws, and that takes political negotiation. But we're having this conversation, and I really don't know that we would be if it hadn't been for the fact that this was forced in front of people. And the only way you force it, I can't remember which one you said it, but is by kind of breaking stuff and sort of, throwing it out there. And so I feel torn, like, as the answer to that.
And I think it will be interesting. The thing I think about too is who knows what is birthed from these riots, right? Like you have John Lewis, who started out, with the freedom rides, and people saw that as a bad thing back in the day. And now, he turned that into a career in politics and is eliciting change through policy, And so maybe the riots spark something in some young person who then goes on to be the person who helps to create the policy that changes things and helps us to reach the reconciliation that we dream of here on earth, So I just think we never know how God is working things together for good.
That's real. I believe that it has taken this to get us here. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in 1903, African American people having a double conscience. And so you have to talk this way around this group of people, talk this way around, maybe the ethnic group that you belong to. I think now all the masks are off. I think now the soil is ripe now. I think we can talk, and I think we can be truthful. And now you're seeing people say, I didn't know you felt that way. I didn't know that was your struggle. And I think that's awesome, because for the first time, it seems as though we are hearing each other. So I'm going to ask this question, and it may get a bit emotional, but to my two Caucasian brothers, I'm going to ask, what wisdom or questions would you like to ask a person that is African American? What plea would you like to plead with them, if anything? Or what is it that, you want them to know if you were speaking to an African American person who you did not know? And I'm going to ask you to do the inverse to that of a person that may be Caucasian. What would you want them to know? I know I threw y'all that change up, man, but it hit. And you can speak from your heart.
So I just want to, I'm a lawyer, and I just like to, so the question is, what is a piece of wisdom or what is a concept that I would like to convey to a black person who I'm not.
Who you don't know?
Who I don't know.
I mean, it could be a question, but it's a person you don't know, and you would want to communicate to them right now. What would you say? Gosh,
I'm going to be very specific on this. A couple weeks ago, we had the All Together prayer walk, where we walked down Cheshire Bridge and prayed at banks, at restaurants, under bridges, and I was pushing my daughter, who's 2 years old, a couple days ago, and we were walking, and she was in a stroller, and there was a black man in a wheelchair who clearly is suffering from just abject poverty. I mean, and he looked at my daughter and said, her eyes are so beautiful. And I couldn't help, I immediately responded to him and said, your eyes are beautiful. And he smiled. And I was thinking in that moment, or after, when I was reflecting, my daughter's eyes are beautiful, and people of all races and ethnicities tell her that and tell me that all the time. I would imagine that when that guy was 2 years old, that there were no white people out there telling him that his eyes were beautiful. And so that's a person that, I mean, it's very specific, but that's a person who I don't know, and I just want to convey to him that he is beautiful, and I love him, and I learned so much from him making one statement to my daughter.
Scott.
I think that I'm a big fan of authenticity, because I think it allows us to have actual relationships that truly allow everybody to be truly known, and allows, I think, especially the people of faith, we should be able to be the most authentic human beings in the world, because our sins are covered. So even the things we'd be ashamed about, I mean, they're already covered, and if we believe that, then we should be able to be truly ourselves. And I think to your point about the quote from W.B. Du Bois, I have felt that from some of my black friends, where they come around me, and I have to work to get them to turn off their whiteness. And I'm like, I know you don't talk that way. Yeah. Like, this is not you being comfortable. This is you trying to have sort of a more professional relationship with me. Wow. And it feels to me inauthentic. And I want to ask, like, what can I actually do to help you feel as comfortable with me as you would at a family reunion or at a friend's birthday party, wherever you get to act. Wherever it is that you get to act like your true self, what can I do to help breed a ground where that can happen? Because I feel like that is something that white people can try to do, is to proactively sort of work to say, hey, we want the real you. We don't want the whitewashed you. We don't want you to talk the way that my grandmother taught that I was supposed to talk. We want you to talk the way you feel comfortable. We want you to express yourself in ways that you feel comfortable. I mean, honestly, I think this is one of those issues that probably extends even outside of just white and black, and into other races as well. I hear this from my friends who are Hispanic all the time, because they feel like they have to temper their excitement, and that's something that I would just want to look and say, like, I want the real you. I don't want the white version of you. Like, I've got enough white friends. Like, so I think that's something. But honestly, I don't want to ask a lot of questions at this point. I just want to listen. Yeah. And I feel a little bit insecure that the people who have had to experience the oppression are also having to be the ones to lead us out of it. And I think that's not fair, but is the reality. Like, I mean, I think we it's been one of the things that's been so crazy about some of the riots and some of the protests has been, it feels like passionate young white progressives are making these protests and rallies at times sometimes noisier than they would be otherwise, and not in a positive way. That it's taking away from the actual conversations at hand so that certain people can be a part of a revolution. And I almost want to look at that and be like, even in the protests, why are white people trying to lead? Like, and so that there's a lot of emotions and a lot of, you asked for honesty.
No, I appreciate it. Can I say one thing? I'm sorry. I am. He triggered me, man. I in a good way. I will say, as much as you want that family reunion rhetoric, I think the question that many people of any ethnic group feels like, will it be accepted? Will I have to lose something if I take this mask off? Will I be able to still have my job? Will people really, if they saw the real me, would they see it as a good thing or a toxic thing? Is it clean enough for you? And I think that's the battle, you know? I think that is that battle because you're fearful. And we're taught, I even had this talk with my mom. You know, my mom would say, well, Josh, you shouldn't speak up sometimes about this, or don't say it in this way. And I'll say, Mom, that's just our generational difference. Because I need to stand now everywhere you could not, everywhere Dad could not. My mom, and she tells me a story about how my grandfather used to build houses and places in Buckhead and could not even really worship there or walk in there other than when the building was built. And she talked, so when I, came to Second-Ponce, she said, I remember riding down Peachtree with my dad, and he would be excited that you're there because he didn't get the opportunity to come in here. And so I just think, man, that we got to have those type of hard conversations first, and that's hard.
That's your dad. Like that's what I think so fascinating, and what I think sometimes is lost on white people is that that's your father.
Or my
That's,
granddad.
But it's not some family lineage 150 years away. It's like this is someone who theoretically, was a closely connected person. I mean, my father tells me the story of that he was a senior in high school in Columbus when they decided to integrate the schools. And he said, he told me his experiences of you had half his class, so his senior year, half his class are essentially taken away to another school. A half class from the school that was traditionally a black school are taped and they're brought in here. And he said nobody wanted anybody to be there. Like nobody, he said white people were mad that all their friends were leaving, and a lot of the black students, especially the seniors, were like, wait, you're just gonna move me my last year? Like, and so you hear these things, and it's close. I think that's sometimes what not having the conversations, because they're hard, as you've addressed earlier, because we don't have those conversations, we think this was the Civil War.
Yeah.
We forget that, like, no, this was like while Woodstock was going on. This was not that long ago.
Yeah,
it really wasn't.
That's real. So my friends, Lady Love, what would you, tell a Caucasian brother or sister?
Yeah. I think I would say that I am angry. I am tired, but I'm open. And I could not always say that because even now it's been interesting that, when white people ask, how are you doing? Or are you okay? Or what can I do for you? I don't have an answer, I don't know. And then it feels weird, like your polite tendency is to say, thank you for asking, right? But then sometimes it feels weird to say thank you because, like, what am I thanking you for? You know what I mean? Like, it's such an odd situation. But I am open, and I'm, like, checking myself to being open to having conversations, to answering questions, to, like, coming up with a better answer than I don't know. And really, like, being open, kind of to what you were saying, that it is so odd that we didn't put ourselves in this place, but there's so much weight on us to help move the movement forward, and recognizing and, like, acknowledging that imbalance and that, like, inconsistency, and that's not how it should be, but it's what it is. And then saying, okay, so what do you do? If somebody asks you what can they do, fine, here's an article, here's a book, or here's something that I can offer you. But at the end of the day, my big thing is just, angry, tired, but open. Because that's the only way we move forward, is if both sides are open.
I love that. Angry, tired, and open. That's beautiful, man. It is. And so I guess, man, I want to give you a quick hitter. That's what I call it. Quick hitter. If you had to offer a resource to someone, last book you read that was on maybe racial reconciliation or the history of race, we have a resource that's actually going to come up on the screen and be on the Second-Ponce social media site of about 10 to 12 books, but just interested, as you all, or I'm going to call you reconciliation connoisseurs, what are some books or some resources that we could continue the conversation and increase our wisdom on this matter?
I read something by a pastor in Atlanta named Hadi Lewis, and it's just a very short little book called Advocates. And what I love about it is that he's unapologetic and he's honest. I think he's very open in it, but he's also, I think it's just a great place for someone who maybe they haven't really ever read a book on this. It's a great place to start. And it's written by a black man. It's not written by it's not written by someone who looks like me, or you for that matter. But we're just we sort of look similar. He doesn't have the facial hair.
Cool. You all have any resources to offer? You did say a real good one with Just Mercy.
Well, I mean, anything by, I would say buy the book Just Mercy, see the movie, look him up on YouTube. He's got a really great TED Talk that's like 15 minutes. He's got some really good interviews on, a lot of the talking heads on the news are really frustrating to watch. He provides some really good insight. But I'm more interested to see, whatever the 12 books that you're recommending. This is a part where it's difficult for me sometimes to be a follower. I generally like to, and just always naturally kind of see myself in a position where I'm like leading, and it's important for me to follow y'all. My pastor and church member. I'm going to continue this path on racial reconciliation by following the two of you. And so I'm not going to read 12 books.
Go ahead.
Because I have a 2-year-old. But I'm going to look through your list and read some of that.
Well, listen, she's it. I come out the shower and Lauren will say, "Hey, you read this book?" And I'm like, "Oh man." So, do you have any?
I was actually not gonna go book. I was gonna go documentary. So Netflix has a documentary called 13th about the 13th Amendment and just the mass incarceration that I think it's a few years old, but it gives such a picture of what slavery today looks like. The other one would be When They See Us, and these are both by Ava DuVernay. When They See Us is like hard to watch, like you haven't even watched it because it's like a horror movie in a way. It's terrible, but it really gives a picture of like these things that are happening to black people that are not because they, didn't turn on their turn signal, but literally, did nothing. So those would be two things to watch. But I think the list of books will be really good. I can't remember all the books that are on there, but I think all of them are really good resources as well.
I say this, the book Roadmap to Reconciliation, it was offered by Brenda Salter McNeil. She's in Seattle. She is amazing. She tells us, how do we make reconciliation a norm? And I read it. It's a short book, but man, it's powerful. Because she talks about this catalytic event, and that's what this is.
Have either of you guys read the book The Color of Compromise?
Oh yes, by Jamon Tisby.
I've never read it, but I had a pastor the other day of a predominantly white church, pretty large white church, tell me, I think this should be required reading of every person who's in our church.
That's a good one.
Okay, so I haven't read it, so I can't.
Those two there, I would say, please read those in this year, The Color of Compromise and Roadmap to Reconciliation. And so, man, to just offer the cliff notes for anybody that could be just jumping in. You're angry, you're frustrated, you're tired, but you're open. Reconciliation is a dream, but also can be our reality if we learn to relinquish some things, reimagine our structures in some ways. And so, friends, we end today hopeful But the work does not stop just with a prayer walk, just with a conversation. We need to move past optical diversity. So to my white brothers and sisters, even in faith communities, don't just go hire a black person and say, okay, we've done our job. No. Reconciliation is the gospel, and we got to live that out. That means those people, who you hire, don't think just black, think Asian. Don't think just Asian, think Latinx, Think about all of God's creation. And as we do that, let's learn to do life together. And so, Jonathan, Peyton, and Lauren, thank y'all, man, for this creative conversation.
Thank you for having us.
And I pray it's not the last one. And so, it's been my pleasure. And I'm going to ask if Lauren will close us out in prayer.
Lord, we just come to you right now saying thank you. Thank you that even with everything going on in the world, that you still sit on the throne and you are still in charge. Thank you for the opportunity to have conversations about race, God, to move our society closer to what heaven looks like, God, because that truly is our goal as Christians, to have heaven on earth. Lord, continue to work in the lives and in the hearts of your people, God. Continue to keep those who are on the front lines protesting and organizing activism all over the nation, God. Help to keep them safe, God. Help to keep them encouraged and hopeful, God. Help us all to reach out and step outside of our comfort zones to have a conversation with someone that we may never have talked to before. Lord, help us all to recognize that this is continuous work, God. Help us to speak up in the spaces where we find ourselves, whether it's our churches, our jobs, our homes. Just help us to be the light that you called us to be, God. Lord, we thank you for Second-Ponce and for them giving us the opportunity to do this. We thank you for Josh and his leadership in this endeavor. And we just ask that you would be with us and bless us, God. We love you, we thank you, we praise you. And it's in your son Jesus' name that we do pray. Amen.